My, oh my, what a wonderful day. I used to sing that on my way to work in the morning.
That was former House Speaker John Boehner, September 25th, 2015, starting a press conference by singing. And here's Speaker Boehner again, ending that same press conference and still singing.
Speaker Boehner, you seem very relieved in your
Zippity-doo-dah.
Why was John Boehner so happy during that press conference 10 years ago this fall? Why did he seem, as that reporter observed, very relieved? What did John Boehner say between opening with zippity-doo-dah and closing with zippity-doo-dah? And why relive all that now? The answers from two very special guests in this episode of C-SPAN's podcast, The Weekly. Before we bring in our guests, let's go one day earlier, September 24th, 2015, inside the chamber of the U.S. House of Representatives. There's a big speech in Congress. Is it John Boehner? Nope, it's the Pope. Pope Francis addressing a joint meeting of Congress, the first pontiff in history to address both chambers, and he's discussing the Golden Rule.
Do unto others as you will have them do unto you. This rule points us in a clear direction. Let us treat others with the same passion and compassion with which we want to be treated. Let us seek for others the same possibilities which we seek for ourselves. Let us help others to grow as we would like to be helped ourselves.
Now back to John Boehner's press conference the next day, September 25th, 2015. He makes a surprise, stunning announcement, and he also mentions the Pope. And John Boehner also mentions the Pope's mention of the Golden Rule.
So this morning I informed my colleagues that I would resign from the speakership and resign from Congress at the end of October. Now, as you've often heard me say, this isn't about me. It's about the people. It's about the institution. Just yesterday, we witnessed the awesome sight of Pope Francis addressing the greatest legislative body in the world. And I hope that we will all heed his call to live by the Golden Rule. But last night I started to think about this, and this morning I woke up and I said my prayers, as I always do, and I decided, today's the day I'm going to do this. As simple as that.
The end of John Boehner's career in Congress coincided with the beginning of a new force among House Republicans, the House Freedom Caucus. In fact, on September 25th, 2015, right after John Boehner's shocker of an announcement, C-SPAN brought on a guest to explain what just happened, and the guest talked about the House Freedom Caucus.
Now, what about this Freedom Caucus? Who are they, first of all, and what are they saying about this resignation?
So the Freedom Caucus is this sort of breakaway group of about 40. They don't really officially release all the names, so they say they have about 40 Republicans who used to be part of the normal conservative caucus, the study committee, but they broke away from that and formed their own group, and they have been the most far-right agitators for Boehner. People like Mick Mulvaney of South Carolina, Raul Labrador of Idaho, Jim Jordan of Ohio. And they basically want to try to get one of their own into one of the leadership ranks. They sort of feel like they forced Boehner's hand in the last week or so, and they feel like they need to get one of their own up there. It's a very difficult task because these are the 40 most conservative guys, and you've got to appeal to a group of 246 Republicans who will actually be voting in these internal elections. So they have to broaden their reach beyond just their sort of group of 40.
And who was that expert guest on C-SPAN 10 years ago to talk about John Boehner and the House Freedom Caucus? The same guest who's here with us right now in the C-SPAN radio studio, Paul Kane, senior congressional correspondent and columnist for the Washington Post, along with Leanne Caldwell, chief Washington correspondent at Puck. These two top Congress reporters recently wrote about the House Freedom Caucus. Paul Kane, welcome back to C-SPAN 10 years later.
Wow. Nothing has changed in 10 years, Howard.
Leanne Caldwell and Paul Kane, welcome to C-SPAN's podcast, The Weekly. Great to have you both here.
Thank
to be
you.
here.
All right, Paul, take us back 10 years ago. You were on C-SPAN talking about this. Now talk about it again.
Yeah, so 10 years ago, the Freedom Caucus was in its infancy, really. It was their first year. Their co-chairs at that time were Jim Jordan of Ohio and Mark Meadows of North Carolina, if anybody can remember him, who went on to be White House Chief of Staff and got all sorts of subpoenas, and who knows why he isn't back in the White House now, but he's not. They drove Boehner crazy, and they were threatening to force one of those votes that we went through 2 years ago with Kevin McCarthy, the motion to vacate. It was really a big fight over the usual type of things, immigration and government funding. And Boehner reached a point where he was done dealing with these guys. He has said after the fact that he wanted to retire at the end of the year, the end of 2015, but then he didn't want to put his best allies through one of these grueling votes because Boehner had become such an establishment figure, and they were going to force a vote that was the equivalent of a no confidence vote, and he decided he got his papal blessing. This is something that, like, he was trying to get the Pope back when he was a first or second term member in the early 90s. He started writing letters to the Vatican, to the State Department, and so he got the Pope there, and that was his mic drop moment.
Go ahead, Leanne.
I was going to use that exact same term, the mic drop moment.
Yeah.
But it also, Boehner is a very practicing Catholic. This had a lot of, more than political meaning, it had a lot of emotional, religious, symbolic meaning for him in that moment. And he's a really sentimental and introspective type of guy. And so it was just so fascinating back then that a speaker would resign his power by these, because in large part, because of these insurgents who used power in a way that they figured out a new way to use power on Capitol Hill. They didn't have gavels, they didn't have chairmanships, they didn't have leadership, but they used their votes and their protests, and these are the results they got.
So I'm going to play another clip in a second featuring Leanne Caldwell, but the way you guys are framing this, it's actually really interesting. It's without the insurgents, without the gavel, as you described, John Boehner, and the Pope. And it's amazing the three elements of the story coming together in that sort of way. So,
yeah.
All right. Now, Leanne Caldwell, your turn. And we're going to play a clip of Leanne Caldwell interviewing Congresswoman Nancy Mace, Republican of South Carolina. This was seen on C-SPAN on January 19th, 2023.
Is the focus on what Republicans are focusing on, all the things, that you just mentioned, because of the far right faction of the party and their demands in order for Kevin McCarthy to become Speaker of the House? Has he sacrificed what you won your election on and other Republicans in order just, putting that agenda aside so that he was able to get the Speaker's gavel?
Well, there's nobody besides Kevin McCarthy. And in fact, the majority, or at least half of the Freedom Caucus, actually voted for him every single time. This was just a handful of people trying to exert power. And I've talked about this a lot over the last week, but there are certain members of that small faction that were sending out fundraising emails every time they voted against McCarthy. Others use it as a wedge or a tool to get certain committee assignments. And we saw that this week with some of those members who got very cushy committee assignments. But I will tell you, as someone who operates very independently, I have a gavel now on oversight. I'll be one of 5 or 6 committee chairmen on the oversight committee. And so that gives me some encouragement that our voices are going to be valid. Our voices are going to have a place within the conference. But I do question, and I will continue to publicly question, the bills that we're putting forward that don't have the input of every member of our conference, or don't have the ability to cross over into the Senate and have any chance of passing. Because all we're doing is messaging for the next election. We're not doing anything for the people that we represent.
So, Leanne Caldwell, that was 2 years ago. And Nancy Mace taking swipes at the House Freedom Caucus, if I heard that correctly?
Yeah, very different Nancy Mace than we see now, but yes.
What do we see now from Nancy Mace as opposed to this 2 years ago?
Well, Nancy Mace is someone who's moved. She's not a Freedom Caucus member, but she has moved far to the right. She's hugged the president. She's running for governor of South Carolina. She wants his endorsement. But what was interesting is the Kevin McCarthy moment. And what's different between Kevin McCarthy and John Boehner is that Kevin McCarthy worked very hard to try to bring the Freedom Caucus, some members of the Freedom Caucus, into the fold to give them some of that traditional power on Capitol Hill because he was fearful of them. It obviously didn't work out that way for him in the end. But he had learned from Paul Ryan's mistakes, from John Boehner's mistakes in the past, that alienating them and making them other actually can lead to their own demise. But for Kevin McCarthy, it still led to his demise.
Yeah, McCarthy started off in that marathon session in early January 2023, where I think on the very first vote for House Speaker, 18 Republicans voted against him, either for president or someone else, and then the next vote it was 19, and then 20. I think it hit 22 at one point, and he had to negotiate with them to give away. That's what Leanne was asking Mace about. Like, he gave away a lot of the power of the speakership in order to just really get the gavel, and it left him really powerless. There are two things. It's one, he didn't have nearly as much standing as John Boehner or Paul Ryan did within the entire conference. He was seen as a guy who was always trying to please people, and he also had a much smaller number. So Boehner was managing 247 Republicans 10 years ago, which is an ginormous number, incredible to even think about now. And McCarthy had 222. And so he really knew that at any moment, if 5, trying to do math, 222 minus 5 is 217. 218 is the magic number. So McCarthy always knew if 5 people turned on him, his only way to survive a vote, a motion to vacate vote, was with Democratic support. So he constantly kept caving to the Freedom Caucus or Freedom Caucus adjacent people, because he couldn't govern otherwise. Mike Johnson has done a lot of the same things in the last 2 years. Whenever he has to, he has given in. The last 9 months, he's had Trump to be his enforcer to try and get things done.
All right, I'm going to bring in Trump in a second, but I have a question for both of you. So we're talking 2023 McCarthy. The House Freedom Caucus, under what you just remember there, Paul, as you say, they're very strong. McCarthy needs votes. Is it because of the slimness of the majority, or is the House Freedom Caucus just really powerful, or is it a combination of the two?
I believe it was Thomas Massie, again, who not actually in the Freedom Caucus, but has traditionally been friends with them since he came into office in early 2013. On election night 2022, when we realized it was going to be a really small majority, Massie said something like, well, this makes us relevant now. And there's about half of the Freedom Caucus, so they never put out their official list of members, unlike every other caucus in Congress. They have about 20 that are pretty hardcore and will stick together when they need to on votes. And when you only have a margin, if you only have 220 in your conference, if you have 222, and the Freedom Caucus has 20 people who are willing to stand up and say no, then you're, as speaker, you're kind of stuck. And that has been their power, especially when they don't have a president, especially when they're going up against a president of the other party. That's usually when they've decided to flex that power the most.
Okay, Leanne, I'm going to bring you in. I'm going to play a clip from Donald Trump in 2015, and you mentioned Donald Trump in the context of Nancy Mace. So I'm going to have you react to this. This is the looming figure we haven't yet talked about. Here's Donald Trump before he was president, October 12th, 2015, campaigning in New Hampshire and speaking at a No Labels convention.
I'm curious what your perspective is on the Freedom Caucus, or AKA, I guess, the Tea Party, which, of course, has been at the heart of...
But I love the Tea Party.
Okay.
I do. I love the Tea Party.
This is good.
You know what? The Tea Party,
compromise.
I'll tell you about the Tea Party. These are people, in all fairness, because you can't really... These are people that love this country. They do love this country, and they want the country to be great. I mean, it's very important.
Question was about the House Freedom Caucus. He answers in the context of the Tea Party. Just to set the table, that was the predecessor of the Tea Party?
The Freedom Caucus was grown as the Tea Party was the roots to the Freedom Caucus.
Gotcha. Okay.
On Capitol Hill. But the president, that was 2015. He hadn't been elected yet. He was needing the support of the base and Republican voters to get elected. And so, he was very deferential and publicly supportive of the Freedom Caucus. But in the era of Trump over the last decade, it's been a really fascinating transformation politically and transition of the Freedom Caucus, because Donald Trump does not espouse traditional Freedom Caucus beliefs.
No.
He is not a small government funding type of Republican, which was most important to the Freedom Caucus. They were created to reduce the size of government, to drastically reduce government funding. And we saw, and during Donald Trump's first term, the deficits and debt skyrocketed. It's not something he cared about. Now in this term, he has some people like Russ Vought, who also come from the Freedom Caucus Tea Party strain of the party, who do support that, but these are not priorities for the president at all. And so you've had this really fascinating, experiment really with the Freedom Caucus, where they are torn between their small government principles and a president who is ignoring those principles left and right. And they're having to choose between their principles and the president. And in some respects, they've tried to stand up for their principles, but ultimately they always end up caving on the side of the president. And, we can talk about that now or later, but this entire government shutdown is just like bizarro opposite world. The fact that you have, the Freedom Caucus, who has been pushing for a short-term government spending bill, and this is something that they were adamantly opposed to for many, many years.
Something to think about, the most influential current members of the Freedom Caucus are people like Chip Roy of Texas, Ralph Norman of South Carolina. The chair is Andy Harris of Maryland. A bunch of them at the start of the third Trump presidential campaign endorsed Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis had served in the House for 3 terms last decade, was a founding member of the House Freedom Caucus. So people like Chip Roy were more in line with DeSantis. Ralph Norman actually endorsed Nikki Haley, who was governor of South Carolina when Ralph Norman got going. And then slowly but surely, Trump ground everybody else down in the campaign to the point where he was running against ghost Nikki Haley, who kept getting 20% or so of the vote, even though she had withdrawn. And one by one, they all came back and endorsed Trump. But yeah, deep down, they don't agree with Trump and his principles. My gosh, for all of the layoffs that Russ Vought and Elon Musk sort of engineered in the federal workforce in the first few months this year, I think they'll probably be evaporated by the ICE hiring binge that, just watch a NFL game on Sunday or a baseball playoff game, and you're going to see those ads talking about $50,000 bonuses to hire new ICE agents. They're going to flood the country with those are federal workers. This is not the sort of thing that Russ Vought and people were, conjuring up as the Tea Party started to move 15 years ago and the Freedom Caucus started to assemble 10 years ago.
We won't mention the ICE ads that ran during the Philadelphia Phillies playoff game, will we, Paul?
Oh.
My apologies for that. All right. I want to bring, and I can say that publicly because you have publicly said you are a Phillies fan. So
I do.
That's on the record. I want to bring in a Democratic voice now, the clip with Chuck Schumer. This is from a month after Donald Trump won the presidency. December 6, 2016, speaking to reporters, here's incoming Minority Leader Chuck Schumer.
And one final point. Mitch McConnell said they want to start repealing Obamacare the first week. ACA, bring it on. They don't know what to do. They don't know how long. They know they can't just repeal it. So they say, we'll do it 3 years from now. But then the Freedom Caucus says, oh, no, don't do it 3 years from now. They have nothing to put in its place. And believe me, just repealing Obamacare, even though they have nothing to put in its place, and saying they'll do it sometime down the road, will cause huge calamity from one end of America to the other. They don't know what to do. They're like the dog that caught the bus. To our Republican friends across the aisle, bring it on.
All right, Leanne Caldwell of Puck. So this is 9 years ago, and they're talking about Obamacare and Republicans in the House Freedom Caucus, which is kind of what we are talking about as we tape this on October 7th.
Yeah.
So do storylines change much between Chuck Schumer and the Republicans, or do they stay the same?
No, yeah. History repeats itself over and over again. The 2018 we can even go further back than that. The 2013 government shutdown, which is when the Freedom Caucus was starting to bubble, that was over Obamacare. That's when Ted Cruz went to the Senate floor, read that Dr. Seuss book, Green Eggs and Ham, I think it was, to his kids because he was missing bedtime, and forced the government to shut down. But behind the Ted Cruz strategy, actually, was Mark Meadows, brand new freshman member of the House of Representatives from North Carolina, who was strategizing and organizing the use to shut down the government in order to try to repeal Obamacare. I will never forget, I wrote a story. I was working at CNN at the time, and I wrote a story about this little-known congressman called Mark Meadows, and the headline of the story was Architect of a Government Shutdown. Of course, this was the Ted Cruz shutdown. Mark Meadows has never forgiven me for that headline. He says that I was the one who made him infamous.
He loved every moment of it.
100%. And he was the one who made those decisions. But that was the first, that was when the Freedom Caucus was starting to form and figure out how to use the government tactics to their own for their own means. And so that was 2013. Fast forward to 2016. Chuck Schumer's speech, Republicans led by the Freedom Caucus tried to repeal Obamacare. It failed, obviously, and healthcare and Obamacare was a major issue in the 2018 midterm elections. And Democrats now, in the first midterms of the president's second term, are also hoping that Obamacare, healthcare are going to be a political issue.
Real quick on that, it's always sort of remembered with John McCain thumb down as the thing that stopped the repeal of the ACA. What's often forgotten, though, is in the spring of 2017 was the first seeds of Trump just clamping down on the Freedom Caucus and them breaking to his will. The first effort in the House, Paul Ryan, the Speaker at the time, had to pull the bill because the Freedom Caucus deemed it not conservative enough. Well, it was conservative enough for Donald J. Trump. I was at the DCA, the Reagan Washington National Airport. After that vote, I was going to spring training, watch some baseball, and I saw all the members of Congress, and I saw Mark Meadows, who looked like he'd seen a ghost because he just took down temporarily a bill that Trump wanted. And over the next week of that spring recess, Donald Trump put all of his Twitter tweet, back then it was all still called Twitter, fired away at Mark Meadows like every single day. Meadows came back to the Capitol after the recess, went to Paul Ryan's office and was like, all right, what do we got to do? Let's get this passed. And they ended up passing a bill that was more closely aligned with what Paul Ryan wanted. And that was sort of like the first time you saw, oh, wait, Trump is bigger than these guys.
So, Paul Kane, you're a pro because the next clip I want to play is from May 4th, 2017. Here's President Trump. Everything you just mentioned. Here's President Trump, May 4th, 2017. He's speaking in the Rose Garden of the White House just after the House voted to pass the Republican replacement bill for the Affordable Care Act.
I want to thank Paul Ryan. He has worked so hard. And I was joking. I said, Paul, for the last week I've been hearing Paul Ryan doesn't have it. It's not working with Paul Ryan. He's going to get rid of Paul Ryan. Then today I heard Paul Ryan's a genius. He's come along. I'll take whatever. The groups have all come together. We have the Tuesday group. We have so many groups. We have the Freedom Caucus.
All right, either one of you take that one. Have fun with that one. Leanne?
I mean, you said it right there that the Freedom Caucus came on board. And we have not seen them really be able to invoke the power that they would like to wield as aggressively as they would like during the Trump administration. They had a little bit of a resurgence during Biden. They helped to get rid of Speaker McCarthy. There was other elements to that too, including some non-Freedom Caucus members who played a role, but they were a part of it. And now they are trying to figure out, they're probably at their weakest point right now that they have been at since they were officially became a group in January of 2015.
They kind of lose interest in Congress when Trump is president. After he took office in January 2017, several of them just went to the administration. Mick Mulvaney left the Freedom Caucus and became OMB director, the budget director, and then he became acting White House chief of staff. I think he was the longest serving chief of staff, but always had acting as his title. He was then succeeded by Mark Meadows, who left Congress because it wasn't really fun anymore to be in Congress as a Freedom Caucus member, and he went to the White House, became chief of staff. And now, we're only a little more than 9 months into this new Trump administration. And what's happening with a lot of the Freedom Caucus people? They're running for governor. Mm-hmm. They're running for Senate. Chip Roy is running for State Attorney General of Texas. Ralph Norman's running for governor of South Carolina. I'm blanking on a few others.
Andy Biggs is running for governor.
Andy Biggs.
Arizona.
Yeah.
There's a long list, yeah.
And
you both have written about this, and as you've written about very well in Puck, they're just leaving to run for other offices. That's the bottom line of this, right? Okay. All right. In our remaining few minutes, I want to play one more clip. There's so many different storylines here. I'm going to go back to John Boehner's final press conference. John Boehner leaves Congress on October 30th, 2015. His final press conference was 3 days earlier, October 27th, 2015. The press conference topic, a bipartisan budget bill. The 2-year deal would increase spending by $80 billion over 2 years. It would increase the federal borrowing limit through 2017. Speaker Boehner was asked about the House Freedom Caucus.
The Freedom Caucus has caused you a lot of problems, obviously. Here in your final act, you're rolling them. Can you describe your thought process there?
I wouldn't quite describe it that way. We have a bipartisan agreement that makes sure that the debt ceiling is increased, and we make good on our debt and our debt service, and it paves the way to fund the government this year and next. And the fact is that this will make it easier for the entire Congress for the balance of this year, and it'll make next year a whole lot smoother for the Congress as well.
All right, Leanne Caldwell and Paul Keene, final thoughts. John Boehner, did it go a lot smoother the next year for the Republicans? Who wants to touch that one?
If your definition of smooth is, did they have government shutdowns? They went, more than 5 years between the 2013 shutdown and the end of 2018 shutdown. So on that level, it was smoother. They didn't have really any massive standoffs on debt ceiling issues, but in terms of pure governance, no, it wasn't any smoother, and that's why Paul Ryan only lasted like 3 years and a couple months in the job, and he decided, like Boehner, at a sooner time, at a much younger age, also decided to heck with this, and he retired from Congress at the ripe old age of like 52, not even 53 yet, I don't think.
And to kind of bring it back to present day and a little bit forward looking as we end here, the Freedom Caucus over the past several years has maneuvered their way to get powerful positions leading committees or on very important committees. And that has made it actually harder for them to stymie leadership, because now they're kind of part of the conversation. But also in these very slim margins that House Republicans have had, the moderates have realized that their votes matter just as much. They are notorious for folding to and deciding with leadership, but there is some more tension between the Freedom Caucus of the far right and the moderates, who call themselves the majority makers, because they're the ones who have to face voters in these swing districts. And so it's a really interesting dynamic, even though the Freedom Caucus is relatively weak right now. I think that it's not going away. We're already starting to see signs of efforts for it to reemerge. I wrote about this a couple weeks ago with Senator Ted Cruz and his prepping for his 2028 presidential run. The way he's maneuvering is not just to find a specific lane and what could be a very crowded primary, but also he wants to bring the Republican Party back to its Freedom Caucus, Tea Party days, and that be kind of like the post-Trump vision of Republicans. We'll see if it works. I'm not sure, but they're going to putter along for a while, and their staying power is in question.
And Leanne, to be clear, you said Ted Cruz 2028 is what you just said, right?
Ted Cruz 2028.
All right. Okay.
Yep.
Go ahead, Paul. One epilogue in all of this. John Boehner is living his zippity-doo-dah life.
Yes, he is.
I caught up with him in mid-August, when he was on his way back from a 12,000-mile drive with him and two buddies from Cincinnati to outside Anchorage, Alaska, a little town of Girdwood, where they lived for a month and fished, and then drove all the way back in his Cadillac Escalade. He told me it's 3 pals: drive, eat, drink, and be merry. Every day is an adventure.
Well, speaking of being merry, thank you, Leanne Caldwell of Puck and Paul Keene of the Washington Post, for joining us for this episode of C-SPAN's Podcast The Weekly. And for our closing music, we go out the same way we began, the same way Speaker Boehner went out 10 years ago. The hit song from Walt Disney's Song of the South. Released in 1946, it won the 1947 Academy Award for Best Song. Here again, the musical stylings of John Boehner and Zippity Doo Dah.
My, oh my, what a wonderful day. I used to sing that on my way to work in the morning.